Well, Vlada, like I said, there is so much to talk about in that film. But where I'd like to start actually is to learn a little bit more about you and how you have progressed in your life to get to this point where you are. I know that you studied psychology, you did your doctorate in cognitive science, and now you're a filmmaker. Can you tell us about that journey and how you got to be where you are now?
Sure, I'll try. It's been quite a journey. So, it's interesting. I started out when I was little as someone who loved art, visual art, and visual storytelling. So I think I started out there in sort of that filmmaking mindset. But then I went on a tangent, and I was always very interested in psychology. So I went in that direction for a while. Cognitive science is interesting. It's the study of how the brain processes information. And that was always very interesting to me. And I specifically actually studied visual perception, scene perception, which consciously I wasn't thinking this way then, but scene perception, the study of how your brain processes scenes and objects actually is very relevant to filmmaking, and it's been very useful for me since then. I think all storytellers, all filmmakers have to be psychologists in a way. I mean, it's very important to understand, to have a sort of a good intuition or an understanding of human behavior, human motivations, in order to be an effective storyteller and filmmaker. So I think it all kind of came together in the right direction eventually. I mean, I realized in my 30s that this is what I kind of was meant to do in a way, to be a filmmaker. This is what I've always wanted. So I kind of brought myself back to this point after going through academia and then the tech industry for a little while, Microsoft as well.
So one of the other films that you've made, Having It All, looks at motherhood. And then in this film, it's a little bit different. You're in front of the camera, you're behind the camera. What was it like to make a film that was at least partly autobiographical?
It's not easy, and it's not something I ever actually set out to do. So I'm not somebody that actually has ever wanted to be in front of the camera, and this was a very special situation. And I don't have any plans of doing this again. I'm planning on making more films, but I'll stay behind the camera. I mean, this was actually, this went beyond filmmaking. This went beyond my career and what I like doing, as part of my job. This went into the territory of, my own child's future. Her civil rights, her human rights are being attacked. Not just hers, but those of all people like her around the world, in our country, in our state. And so this had more to do with the necessity of just kind of, when you have a certain skill, when you have the resources, when you have the ability to step up and do what's necessary, do what's right to fight an injustice, you kind of just go ahead and do whatever you can. And so at that point, this whole idea of me being uncomfortable, putting myself in front of the camera, or even my own family in front of the camera, I mean, I had to sort of push all those concerns aside because this was a much bigger necessity than, any personal concerns I might have had.
I thought that one of the most powerful moments in the film is when you were talking with your daughter, and she made the comment that she wanted essentially to be unborn.
Yeah.
That it was just this heartbreaking moment. And you also talk about this transition when a child socially transitions, at least in your case, and it sounds like in some of the other cases that you're familiar with. There's a move from an experience of some serious desolation and depression and even suicidal thoughts to more of a sort of a happy and in many ways just an ordinary kid's life. How common is that part of the transition, and how does it fit into your family's experience?
Well, it's from my own experience and from everything I've seen and learned and read in the past 5 years or so, it's extremely common. I could probably say it's universal. So, this idea of having the opportunity to just grow up to be a regular kid, to have a regular childhood, meaning that, you could just be yourself and follow your instincts and learn and grow and be safe and secure in your family and be taken care of by people who love you, whom you trust, who love you, protect you, and give you all the tools you need to grow up to be a productive person. This idea is something that, when you haven't had the experience of either living with a transgender person or being a transgender person, it's an idea we take for granted. We don't even think about it. It's just life. This is what you do. You play, you learn, you go to school, you complain, you love your parents or, whatever, and you grow up. But having had the experience of having a transgender child and also meeting many transgender kids since then, I've met personally dozens. I know through social media and through our networks, hundreds, if not more, families with transgender kids. It's an incredible experience to have a child who is suffering, and you day in, day out, they're suffering, and initially they're telling you they're suffering when they still trust you, and seeing that sort of that downward spiral into what is going to end up being full-on depression if you don't do something about it. And essentially, even subconsciously, if you're not willing to admit it, knowing why. Because they do tell you initially, I'm not the gender you're saying I am. I'm not a boy, I'm a girl, or I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. And kids at that young age who are sort of more binary, so to speak, not necessarily like non-binary, they know this. My daughter knew this at age 3, and many other trans kids I've met knew it too. But and they do express that message to you. But if you shut it down, if you express extreme anger or disgust or shock or whatever, eventually they'll stop telling you that, and they'll try to just survive, to just live and survive and cope. And that's a really horrible situation in and of itself because the child becomes isolated. But if you listen to your child, and if you actually try to help them and do something, which is what my husband and I tried to do, and then, and it takes a while for parents, we all, my husband and I coped with it for about a year before we finally kind of came to that point where we said, this is it, we're not torturing our child anymore. We have to just let her live as herself. And we're the ones who are transitioning at that point. She's staying the same person. We have to change. And when you do that, and you just say, yep, we're gonna change your name. You could grow your hair out. I'm gonna buy you a bunch of dresses. And just that, you're not doing anything other than just letting her be herself, use the right pronouns, use a different name, let her dress the way she wants. Seeing that transformation, it's almost overnight, for a young child, because she hasn't had that much damage done to her psychologically yet. It's really difficult to describe. I mean, it literally is like the sun comes out. You've had this dark cloud over your family for a year or so, and then the sun comes out and the rainbows are out, and your child is laughing and singing and dancing like a regular child. All of a sudden, your child is a normal child. They're happy, they're joyful, they're giggling. Those things that regular kids do, you take that for granted, but a child who's depressed doesn't do that. And all of a sudden she's saying, okay, I'm sorry, I'm gonna do this, but I'll never forget the moment when she had a dress on and she started twirling around in the family room and said, look how beautiful I am, I'm beautiful. She had never ever said that in her life. It was the first time I heard my daughter say, I'm beautiful, and I broke down. I mean, it was awful. But this is a pretty universal experience from what I've seen with trans kids, all the families that I've met and known. It's the parents always say, the sun comes out all of a sudden, and your child becomes alive.
Where do non-binary kids fit into this story and into this debate? So a lot of the kids that were featured in your film do identify pretty clearly as a boy or as a girl.
Right.
What about non-binary kids in this story?
So they're not in this film. So our society, unfortunately, is set up in this very sort of artificial, contrived way where we kind of have defined human beings as binary, male or female. That's not the realistic approach to what human beings really are. So the reality is people aren't binary, gender is a spectrum, for lack of a better word. Can you still hear me? But this is the way, traditionally our modern Western society has been set up. And it's not always been this way. There have been other civilizations before us that actually understood that gender wasn't binary, but this is the way it's been here in our world for the last, 1,000 years or whatever, 1,000 years. But non-binary kids are also regular kids, regular human beings, ordinary, normal human beings. They exist, and we all kind of have aspects of being gender non-conforming. Each one of us does. We all are sort of a combination of maleness and femaleness. We have to, first, we have to educate people about gender in general, and this is what this film is trying to do, in order to break our society out of this really artificial, contrived sort of schema of what gender is, or what, how human beings are sort of categorized. I mean, all I could say is we have to move forward as a society and make room for non-binary people, because they're here, they're everywhere. They're just regular human beings who are not very male or very female. They're somewhere in the middle. And I think we're doing that as a society, but unfortunately, it's like there's so much information you have to kind of like download it before going all the way to all the nuanced sort of understanding of gender, that I didn't have time to, or I didn't have the space in this particular story to talk about non-binary people. But we as a society need to sort of move forward and make space for that, for sure.
All right. Looks like we have a question.
Hello. I really appreciated the film, and I really loved the way you encapsulated so much joy within it, because I think that can be lost in a lot of these spaces, and especially these spaces fighting for equity or fighting for equity on part of somebody else. We sort of focus on all the negatives and not the positives we are searching for. Mm-hmm. And something that I would love to get your opinion on is what is, like when we're looking at this framework of transgender rights, it's embedded within a religious setting, it's embedded within a setting of feminism and sort of gender equality on a more fundamental basis. And so what is the foothold that you found most effective when talking to various community members about this? Because I loved your mosaic model, right? But that is such a hard, lofty concept for some people, because I think that ultimately what you were getting at before is that gender is this performance that we all put on. It is not, we can not really find a basis for it anywhere, but that I've learned is not the best foothold for a lot of people, but also this we're all human foothold can be somewhat invisibilizing in some ways, because yes, we are all human, but some of us humans need different accommodations in life. And so I was wondering, what have you found that's most effective? Because I think the theoretical realm of this is totally different from the practical realm in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so I mean, first, there's a lot of different elements to that question. I mean, first, I think it's important for us to be able to have the conversation and to understand that this whole theoretical concept of gender being a construct of society, yes, that is in some way true, but you have to separate that from also this other definition of gender and other sort of reality of gender, which is it's also biological, and being transgender is a biological state. You are born with the gender that you're born with, and that's why I tried to explain in the film that, people don't pull it out of the air, as Dr. Olson Kennedy explained. We are born with the sense of what gender we are. It's biological, it's coded, so to speak, in our neural system. And that's true of all human beings. So we also have to understand that we're talking about a human state, not just a cisgender or transgender state. We all, as human beings, get our sense of our own gender in the same exact way. And that's true of transgender people and cisgender people. So there's that, and then this idea of gender being a construct, well, that's a whole other definition of gender, essentially. And as far as what is the best way to, the funny thing is we could talk in circles forever. There are all these arguments about, gender is only a construct, and when you as a transgender woman say you're a woman, you're not really that. We could go in circles around that because some people are just unwilling to believe the science and the facts and the research about where gender really lies in human beings. But what I find as the foothold, so to speak, which is what you were asking, how do people really get convinced that, transgender rights are human rights? It's by knowing transgender people. It's by meeting transgender kids. Anybody who's met our kids, my daughter lives in a large neighborhood, society, school, whatever, community. Anyone who's met transgender kids actually recognizes and realizes very quickly that they're just regular people like everybody else. They're human beings. And their understanding and knowledge of who they are is the same as everybody else's. So, yeah, we can have these sort of theoretical discussions, and people who aren't willing to look at the research or acknowledge the research may never want to do that. But if they get to know a transgender person, or if they have a transgender child all of a sudden who's born to them, whatever they used to think, that will change. Because the reality is that these are regular human beings who are who they say they are. If that makes sense.
First of all, I absolutely have to echo all the praises and the thanks for making this. It was a really wonderful experience to watch this and to see the joy that, as you so well put, you encapsulated in this. For me, whenever it comes to talking to people and trying to educating people, the most soul-crushing moment is when you bring all these arguments to the table and you lay out all these bases for why transgender people are just like us and have the same rights as us, and then they come back with, well, that's not how God intended it. And
Not how God intended it.
it's not how God intended it. And clearly, the movement, I saw in the piece, so many allies in religious areas, so many speeches that you were giving in churches. But I also heard people saying, well, God created man and woman, we need to respect that. So with no disrespect to religious institutions at all, when that's the counter argument that people are coming at you with, how often did you see that, and how did you and the people you're working with deal with that counter argument?
It's a similar answer to what I said before. People, even who are very entrenched in certain religious beliefs, their beliefs actually change once they see the reality of things. So there's that. But, religious beliefs are strong and important and extremely necessary sort of aspects of certain of people's lives. There's a reason why there is a necessity for a separation of church and state, because when we as a society live together and have a diversity of religions and cultures and points of view and ways of communicating and doing things, when we all live together as a society, we have to create a certain structure for our society that's not based on any one particular person's religious belief, because religious beliefs are what are beliefs. They're not necessarily based in facts. And so, you can have conversations with people saying, well, people used to say that God didn't make left-handed people. Left-handed people are just evil and sinful, perverted people. People used to say that God never intended for anybody to get divorced. God never intended for anybody to, do this, that, and the other that we all do now, and everybody seems okay with it. So, people could talk about what God intended, but in the end, that's not the necessarily applicable to the reality of human beings' lives currently today. And, if people don't want to acknowledge that fact, there's sometimes not much you can do about it. But there's a reason why we have a justice system, a legal system, a legislative, political system, and why we have a separation of church and state, because we actually all have to live together and make laws and structures in our society that allow all people to move around freely and live freely and not suffer as a result of other, certain people's beliefs. So, that's all I can say to that.
Let's go to the side.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a first-year graduate student at our physician assistant program here at Emory, and I am hoping to go into care of transgender pediatric patients. We had a lecture earlier this week from a pediatrician, and the topic of care of transgender children came up. The person giving our lecture said to the class that the bottom line was if they didn't feel comfortable caring for a transgender child, that they could tell the person that and tell them to find somewhere else to get care. And I would just like to get your opinion on that, because I sort of felt like that was granting providers permission to deny someone their health care right. So I'd just love to get your opinion on that. And then also, if you could have one thing that I could teach my classmates, a whole group of 54 providers that are going to be entering the healthcare field, what would you want me to teach them?
Well, first of all, this idea that healthcare providers have the right to discriminate and not provide a necessary health care to anyone at all for, reasons that are beyond that person's control. This is something the federal government is trying to put into law right now, so they're trying to create policy that says that, we are going to carve out the right of people with certain religious views who are doctors to deny health care services to LGBTQ people or transgender people. I don't think, and we're in this law school, I don't think that's legal yet, but they're trying to provide this policy and put it into law. I don't think that's, this is going to go to the Supreme Court starting October 8th. They're going to start hearing arguments about discrimination against trans or LGBTQ people in the workplace. This kind of decision by the Supreme Court is going to apply to healthcare providers as well. My personal opinion is it's wrong, and I don't think people who go into healthcare in general go into healthcare thinking that they should have the right to deny an innocent person care just because they don't like that person for some reason. I don't think that's how our medical system works. So no, I don't think that's right, and I don't think it's legal currently. We'll see what happens, because I think this is going to be the struggle this year and for the next several years. This idea of people have the right based on their firm beliefs about whether or not somebody has the right to exist, has the right to deny health care, deny housing, deny insurance, deny education, and so on and so forth. I think it's pretty clear what I think about that. You can tell me what you all think about it, but what I would say to the people in your class, as far as trans kids go, I would say, listen to the kids. Listen to the people, listen to what they tell you about their lives, how they feel, what they need, what they want, and believe them. Because we have a social contract as human beings, and it's a necessary one, that when somebody tells us something about their experience, we believe them. Because we have no other way of knowing. When a person comes to a doctor and says, I have a pain in my stomach, the doctor, by default, should be believing what they say, because they're not inside that person's body feeling what they're feeling. We have a social contract amongst each other. This is how we communicate. We say, you tell me about your experience, I'll believe you, and I'll tell you about mine. that's really all we can do, right? It's the same goes for trans kids and trans adults, is when they tell you what's going on with them, believe them and listen to them. They're just like everybody else.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your story. I was just wondering if you could share any stories that you've come across in a pediatrician's or psychologist's office that have either been reaffirming or discouraging, that either your family has experienced, or other stories from parents of other children who are assigned a different gender at birth.
So in the medical field and in psychological field, experiences with doctors. So my own personal experience has been great, luckily, knock on wood. We've had great doctors, and maybe it's because of the area we live in, Seattle, Washington State, Western Washington, that is. But it may also have to do with the fact that I do a lot of research, I study a lot, and then I go in and I tell the doctor, here's what we need. Here's what you're gonna do for us. It may be just a personality thing, I don't know. But our doctors trust us and they trust me. And so things have gone pretty well, and also, but it's really the job of the therapists, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, and the medical doctors to do their research. The thing about it is that worldwide, all the major medical associations and psychiatric and psychological associations all now follow certain guidelines when it comes to trans health. And that's not just a political decision, it's not a personal decision, it's based on real research and science. We have decades of it, and it's overwhelming. Overwhelmingly supportive of the fact that trans people need to be treated as who they say they are. So there's that. But I have heard of horror stories, and it never ends well, and the kids are hurt from it. So when a child goes to a hospital and they're misgendered, and the nurses are told, this is not, Mary, this is Sam, and please use Sam's pronouns, which are he and him, and the nurses refuse to do that. I've heard of that happening, and it's devastating. That child, that boy, that transgender boy, Sam or whoever, he's affected for weeks, for months, for years sometimes. It's a very devastating thing for a child who's scared, who's already had to face bullying and other awful things in their schools or community, and then they go to a hospital where they're supposed to be taken care of, where they're already sick and scared, and people deny their existence by calling them something else. It's not okay. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing your story. I wanted to get your thoughts on, I guess in the headlines there have been more of this lately of sports. So you have, say, like high school transgender people that, self-identify, change to a different division, and then they just absolutely crush it. And to me, it seems like it might be a different debate compared to the bathroom one, because as you point out really well in your film, that your body shouldn't matter when it comes to bathrooms, but in sports, your body does matter. And so I was wondering your thoughts on, policies that should apply in this case.
Okay, well, I'll start by saying I'm not an expert in this field, so, I'm definitely not the person who should be, giving interviews about this topic, because I'm not in sports or, on the International Olympic Committee. But this is what I know. This is what I've read and what I've learned in the past year or so. This whole idea is that you said that they go in and they crush it. From what I've read and learned, that's not actually the case most of the time. So I'm not, again, you'd have to go and research that and find out, do they all crush it? From what I know, they don't. But here's what I do know. Again, I always go back to the research. We also have decades of research on trans athletes. And I do know that ever since, I think, I'm not sure if this data is correct, but 2003, the International Olympic Committee created rules that allow transgender athletes to compete, and then the NCAA has been doing it since, I don't know, maybe about almost a decade now. There are very strict rules, very strict guidelines about which transgender athletes can compete and when they can compete. And I know that that's after a certain period of time of HRT, hormone replacement therapy, which I think you have to have either 6 or 12 months, I can't remember. And then there are a bunch of other rules and guidelines, you know, to make sure that everything is done correctly and based on the research. And what the research shows us is that after a certain period of hormone replacement therapy, any kind of advantage, physical advantage that a trans athlete might have before they transitioned is wiped away. So, you know, people are always scared about trans women. Well, you know, after being on hormone replacement therapy for 6 months or a year or whatever it is, on average, you know, all the statistics show that whatever muscle mass or body mass or whatever advantages they had, they get wiped away. So we also know that since trans athletes have been allowed to compete in the Olympics, I mean, think about it, it's been almost 20 years now. I don't even know how many, if any, have qualified, let alone have won medal. No, I don't think anybody's won a medal, but I mean, think about how many years they've had to do this whole trick of fooling everybody, and all of a sudden all these muscular trans women can go and crush it. Well, they haven't. So why is that? You know, so question these kinds of myths and fear-mongering sort of campaigns about athletes, because we need to look at the reality of things, and also understand that sports are also a human right and a civil right. And all children, including trans children, have the right to compete in sports. So think about it that way and do some research.
First of all, I'm curious, in your experience, whether the siblings have had issues with changing gender for their trans sibling. Or, as my guess would be, they're probably a lot more adaptable than the parents are. My other question relates to the broad concept of there seemed to be a lot more concern about trans in the female locker room than in the male locker room. Yeah. And is that virtually all of the complaining that you hear from the other side, or is there at least a little bit of concern about the female to male coming into the male locker room?
Yeah. So, well, first about siblings. I mean, again, I could talk mostly to my own experience. Younger kids have less trouble understanding that gender is a spectrum or fluid than adults do. So yeah, my kids didn't have much problem with understanding that their sister was their sister. They actually kind of pretty much knew that already. They saw her from the day she was born, and they saw her develop and grow, and they could see that she wasn't changing as a person. She was always herself. So the only issue I had with my two older kids was I was really nervous about not paying them enough attention because we were going through this struggle with my youngest daughter. And so that was my main concern, was that they might feel like they're being sort of neglected or left out or forgotten about. So we tried our best to make sure that they weren't feeling that way. But they had no issues. In fact, my oldest daughter was the one that suggested that my younger daughter change her name. When she changed her name, she kind of had her own little conversation with her and said, you know, if she asked me what I would have named her if she had been born a girl, and I told her, and she asked my youngest daughter, would you like that name? And it was like this big, yes, please, you know. So they had this conversation. They decided that she was gonna be who she was and use that name from then on. So, and then other little kids in my daughter's preschool class and kindergarten class who watched this transition happen, they also kind of came over to her and said, well, we already knew you were a girl anyway, so I don't, you know, why did you have that boy's name that made no sense? So, yeah, little kids get it. It's one of those things that adults, once they grow up having this sort of like schema entrenched in their mind, it's a lot harder to let go of that whole binary schema once you're an adult, but kids don't have it entrenched yet, so. And then the other question was about, yeah, I mean, absolutely, you know, all the fear-mongering and all the sort of campaigns are mostly focused on this fear of transgender women. Yeah, I haven't heard all that many people, in fact, I don't think I've heard any people ever say to me, like, I'm scared of a transgender man going into a men's bathroom. It's, you know, guys don't, why would they be worried? You know, they're not worried. And it's, unfortunately, this whole thing, and this is going to be brought up in the Supreme Court, unfortunately, it's this whole idea that there's something inherently bad about a penis. Something, you know, not about a person and their intentions, but just that thing, that body part makes people scared. I don't honestly know. You know, you could tell me why. I don't know why. But, I mean, I have a trans daughter. This is not an issue for me, you know. But, yeah, for some reason, it's that thing. And it's like this idea, and it's not borne out in reality that there's an, you know, the data and the statistics show that when you have non-discrimination protections for trans people in any city around the country or the world, you don't have this like huge spike all of a sudden in predatory crimes. You don't have these like crazy, scary men in dresses in the bathroom waiting to pounce on people. That just doesn't happen. It's not, you know, we know this is not an epidemic, and this is why law enforcement people and politicians, you know, when they look at the statistics, they have to admit, like, yeah, nothing bad really happened as a result of this. But people still say, you know, but we're all psychologically traumatized now. Well, where's that psychological trauma coming from? It's this idea, and this is what we have to work on, is figuring out how to get people to let go of this idea that a person with a particular body part is inherently bad, you know?
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Vlada, again for coming out here. I want to thank you for this conversation, for your film. There is obviously a lot to think about as we leave today. I especially also want to thank every one of you for coming out. We had lots of co-sponsors. They're listed on the back of your program. Some of them I see here today. And I appreciate you all for coming out. We have staff, faculty, a lot of people went into making this a success. So will you please join me in thanking both Vlada and everyone who made this happen.
Thank you.